How's it going, everyone, and welcome to 4R Ranch. Today I'm pretty excited to be sharing with you a comparison video between the X-Sight 4K Pro and the X-Sight LTV. So the 4K Pro is more or less their flagship model when it comes to a daytime and nighttime digital optic, whereas the LTV is a newer model that has some definite improvements, but it has a few less features in exchange for a smaller overall packaging and less weight on top of your rifle. So if you are on the fence between these two optics, this video is definitely for you. I'm gonna hope to answer the questions on the differences between the two. This video is not intended to be a detailed review on these two optics. However, I do have a video for that. So if you're interested in either of these optics in more detail, check the description below. There will be a link to those videos. Additionally, I will have a link below to where you can pick one of these optics up for yourself if you become interested enough in these to do so after watching this video. And if you're not wanting to stick around for the entire video, check the description once again, where I will have timestamps on the different topics that I'm going to go ahead and cover for the purposes of this comparison. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into this comparison because I'm pretty excited to do so. Now let's talk about some of the similarities between these two optics, starting on the outside and working our way in. So you'll notice they are extremely similar in overall appearance and form factor, but there are some notable differences that we'll get into. But they are both based off of a 30mm tube, so you can use any standard 30mm rings or use the included 30mm rings that come in either of these optics shown on the X-Sight LTV. What is currently on the 4K Pro here is ATN's quick detach mount. Both of these optics are battery powered with a rechargeable battery that is integrated into the optic housing. It is not removable. They are controlled with a button layout on the top of either optic. And both optics have two ports on the right hand side. One is a USB Type-C charging port, the other is a micro SD card slot. Now working our way inwards on the optics in terms of the broad features, they're both a daytime and nighttime compatible optic. They do use digital night vision, so you will need to pair the optic with an infrared illuminator, either the one that's included or an aftermarket one if desired, to get the best performance out of these optics. Although in ambient lighting, it is significantly more sensitive to your low level light than a standard optical rifle scope will be. Both of these optics focus the image on the front objective lens and the image within the optic housing to the user's eyes on the rear objective lens. Both of these optics do have a digital zoom capability, so you can kind of zoom in and get a more fine-tuned shot placement. And finally, both optics do record video. But that's pretty much where the similarities end and the differences start, and that's what the remainder of this video is essentially going to be about. So first things first, I'm sure you noticed right away that they look slightly different. The X-Sight LTV is definitely much smaller and more streamlined than the 4K Pro, and that's because it only comes in at 1.7 pounds when we're talking about the 5 to 15 power, and on the 5 to 20 power 4K Pro, it comes in at 2.2 pounds. Now you might be thinking half a pound isn't that big of a deal, but I assure you if you're using anything for a long period of time without a break, half a pound really does start to add up and feel pretty heavy. The reason for that weight savings on the X-Sight LTV is because it is essentially a bare bones optic that'll let you do only the most critical things, which is use it daytime and nighttime. You can easily sight this optic in so you're on target and you can record video. Now, starting with those features, video on the 4K Pro can be recorded in full 1080p HD with audio, whereas the X-Sight LTV records video in 720p and it lacks audio. So if audio is a deal breaker to you, then you're probably going to be looking at the X-Sight 4K Pro. If it's not that big of a deal to you because video is really only an added perk to an otherwise very capable night vision device, then keep watching because the X-Sight LTV kind of makes up for it in different areas. And they both do have the one-shot zero feature. Other than that, all the features are going to be really awarded to the X-Sight 4K Pro. And again, without getting into a dedicated review and specific details of this optic, I'm just going to name off the features that the 4K Pro can do that the X-Sight LTV cannot do. First is the ballistic calculator that is on board and integrated within the 4K Pro's processor. You can input your ballistic data and range, and that will essentially re-zero your rifle for that designated range that you are now shooting at. which goes into the next feature, and that is that the 4K Pro is laser rangefinder compatible. So if you use the ATN ABL, for example, it has a Bluetooth connection to this optic. Wherever you're aiming, it's telling the scope how far away the target is. And again, if you have enough of that ballistic information inputted into the zero that you were using in terms of ballistic coefficient, muzzle velocity, etc., it will continuously change the zero of your optic. So if you see a target pop out of the bushes at 350 yards, you're already dialed in and ready to take the shot, which is an awesome feature of the 4K Pro that, again, the X-Sight LTV is not set up to be compatible with. Now, in terms of some other bells and whistles, the 4K Pro, like I had mentioned, had that Bluetooth connection. It also has a Wi-Fi connection, so it can connect to any smart device, and it allows for streaming, which is a really useful feature. I've personally used it in the field. I was out with my fiance. She's not usually the most engaged when it comes to hunting, and rather than her just sitting and waiting, not knowing what I'm seeing, she was sitting on her phone and watching exactly what I was seeing through this optic, and even watched me as I took the shot in real time. So it was a really cool experience for her. I remember her even saying, "Wow, good shot." That's something that is really worth its weight in gold almost, those experiences and those moments that the X-Sight LTV can't do because it's not set up to do so. The options are really endless when it comes to that feature alone, and that was one of the things that really drew me into this. For example, let's say you're taking a novice hunter out and you want to really make sure they're taking a good shot, make sure that they're doing what they need to in terms of target identification without being back and forth on the rifle scope. This really has a lot of possibilities with that feature alone. But getting into the next feature, the 4K Pro is compatible with the new ATN mil-dot update, which essentially gives you the mil-dot reticle, and it illuminates on that reticle, again, where the ballistic drop should go, especially when paired to the ABL. And then finally on this list that I'm gonna have up on the screen is the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth compatibility, which again, we've already discussed. But one thing that I hadn't mentioned is that using that, you can connect to the ATN app through your optic and directly download the pictures or videos that you took through the optic onto your smart device. So again, pretty handy to where you don't truly have to take the SD card out of the optic to download and back up those photos or videos. Whereas with the X-Sight LTV, you will absolutely have to remove the SD card and insert it into the computer to download those videos or pictures. So I know what you're thinking, the 4K Pro is probably the way to go. Why am I even still watching this video? Why are we considering the LTV at this point? Well, I'm gonna go ahead and get into the differences that are probably gonna start making you steer back towards the X-Sight LTV. From a practicality standpoint, the X-Sight LTV absolutely blows the 4K Pro out of the water. First example is that you can, from the outside of this optic, hold down a button and it'll pop from daytime to nighttime or vice versa. You can swap, literally into night vision mode at the touch of a button. Why is that important? Well, in terms of talking about a comparison, if you want to go into night vision mode on the 4K Pro, you actually have to get into the menu system, which we'll get into the menu system discussion here in a minute because there's a huge difference there too. But essentially, if you're on a hunt, you're losing light, now the image isn't what you need it to be in order to do good shot placement, you're gonna have to stop what you're doing more or less, get into the menu system and manually change that setting, which may not be a big deal, but it could be a huge deal if that critical moment is lost because the extra time it takes to switch the 4K Pro into night vision. Whereas, like I said, literally at the touch of a button, the X-Sight LTV will go right into night vision mode so you don't miss a beat when you're on your hunt or at your shoot. Similarly, you can adjust the screen brightness on the X-Sight LTV externally without going into the menu system, whereas once again, the 4K Pro, you have to go into the menu system to adjust the brightness. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, if you've never got behind these optics, the highest brightness setting that these are capable of is insanely bright. You can use them in complete sunlight so that you have, complete comfort. You can see what you need to see even if the sun is beating down on you. That being said, if you're at the full brightness in total darkness, it's going to blind you. It's literally going to blind you. So again, in this scenario, you're out in a hunting stand or you're out on a hunt and you start with the sun up. It's on a high brightness so you can see everything in full detail. Before you know it, that sun goes down like it always does real quick when you're on those hunts, and you go behind this to take a shot and you're blinded by the brightness. The X-Sight LTV is as simple as hitting that button to a comfortable setting, and the 4K Pro, again, you have to stop what you're doing, get into the menu system to make that adjustment. Now, kind of on that note, what I personally do with the X-Sight LTV when I'm out in the field with it is I will keep the screen brightness at the lowest level to conserve the battery life, whereas the 4K Pro, I really got to leave it where I need it so that I, again, don't miss those moments since I have to stop what I'm doing to adjust it. So it's going to be a little bit harder on the 4K Pro's battery, whereas the X-Sight LTV, you can use it as a battery saver. Now, speaking of battery, that's another difference, which could be a big deal to some, but probably not all. The LTV has a 10-hour battery life, whereas the 4K Pro has an 18-hour battery life. So it kind of makes up for the fact that you can't use that power saving technique because the battery life is almost doubled. However, in my opinion, 10 hours on either is more than enough unless you are on an insane hunt. You don't feel like using an external battery pack to power it if it is getting close to dying while out in the field. If you do go on a hunting excursion that lasts longer than 10 hours, hit me up in the comments because I want to go with you because I am jealous of your lifestyle. So for the most part, I would expect the 10-hour battery life to be a non-issue to the average shooter or hunter. But again, the X-Sight LTV does have a bit of a loophole in extending the battery life because of the easily accessible screen brightness settings right from the outside of the scope. Now, again, talking about kind of ease of use and accessibility, the menu systems on these are completely different. I'm thinking mainly because the X-Sight LTV just doesn't have that many features, so a complicated menu system isn't really possible. The 4K Pro has a pretty lengthy menu system. Again, I have this both in detail in the independent reviews if you really want to see the difference between the two. This one, there's not too many things you got to go through, so it's much more user-friendly. Whereas the 4K Pro, if it's your first time ever using it, you're going to have to kind of wander around a little bit until you get familiar. You can kind of get lost more or less, but it's not something that isn't impossible to learn after playing around with it a little bit. Whereas if I were to hand you the LTV in the field for the first time, I think you'd be okay without missing anything critical. So now the part that most of you are probably here for, and that is going to be the sample footage portion of this video. Now, I'm not going to really give my input until after the footage rolls so that you can draw your own conclusions. If you're interested in my input on the footage, then skip ahead to that. But other than that, let's go ahead and look at some of the sample footage between the two. Keep in mind the LTV does not have onboard audio. This is 100 yards at 5 power, 8.9 power, 12 power, 15 power. This is 100 yards at 5 power. Okay, this is the ATN 4K Pro at 5 power. No illumination whatsoever, but there is a full moon that is starting to rise. So this is barely visible to the naked eye, but completely visible through the scope. So that is our gate at 120 yards. And again, no illumination. Go ahead and give you a pan. The tree line in the background is 500 yards, roughly anywhere from 450 to 550 depending at the angle we're looking at, so 500 on average. Okay, this is ATN illuminator. Full power. Back to 15 power. Now the ATN illuminator, tree line in the distance. Okay, so now that you've either watched the footage or skipped ahead because you're interested in my technical input between these two, without making this too much about digital camera sensors and sticking to these optics, essentially you have 3,864 pixels in here, making it Ultra HD or 4K, whereas in the X-Sight LTV you have 2,688. So by 1944. So essentially you have a little bit above a 1080p sensor in this optic, whereas in this one you do have a true 4K sensor. Now, what does that mean and why am I pointing that out? Well, because these scope bodies are more or less the same, I think it's a fair assumption to assume that the actual onboard sensor is the same size or very, very close to being the same size. So when you divide that area or the surface area between all those pixels, you know that the 4,000 roughly pixels on this one are going to have much less surface area per pixel than the X-Sight LTV pixels will have. Therefore, it's probably expected that the X-Sight LTV is actually going to do better in low light, whereas if lighting is not an issue, the X-Sight 4K is going to do better in bright light or daytime footage, recording, hunting, shooting, anything in the daytime with this optic. If I just saw the specs of these two on paper, I would definitely point to the 4K Pro for daytime use and the X-Sight LTV for nighttime use. Now, that being said, if you are looking through these optics for the first time, I think you're going to be absolutely happy with either one in terms of nighttime performance. I would guess that a solid majority of you are interested in these because they are night vision compatible. You're going to be happy with either. But if you do compare them at night side by side, the X-Sight LTV, to my eye, my personal opinion when looking through the screen, is a little bit clearer. It feels like it's a little bit sharper at night. There's significantly less noise, and that's to be expected based, again, on those sensors. Just looking at the numbers and the specs, this should induce about half the noise as the 4K sensor. And the same is true with the cameras that I use when recording this video. Currently I'm filming with a 4K camera. I know that the 4K camera is not going to do as well as a 1080p camera in low light. So that's just the name of the game. That is how digital sensors work. It's no fault of the optics specifically. It is just the way it works. If you want more resolution, you're going to get less low light performance. Just how it works. There's no way around it. Now, in terms of the daytime footage, I'm going to kind of let you draw your own conclusions there. Again, it's not totally fair to compare because, again, this is going to be recording 1080p, whereas this is 720p. But for the most part, I would personally be happy with either one of these, especially when you're considering that it's really just kind of an added perk. Most of us are probably drawn into these because they're both daytime and nighttime compatible hunting optics. Okay, so without rambling any further about the details, if there's any unanswered questions at this point in time about these two optics, please leave them in the comments below. I will definitely try to answer any questions that I get that I'm knowledgeable about. I'll try to share some more experience or insight. If you've had an experience with either of these, both good or bad, leave it in the comments below so we can kind of continue to learn from each other. So if you're still sticking around to the end of this video, I can't thank you enough. Please help us out by hitting the like button. Consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on more videos like this to come. Doing things like that really helps promote these videos. The YouTube algorithm absolutely hates the firearms community. It does pretty much everything to not promote these videos so that other people can get information as well. So any kind of interaction with the channel, whether it is hitting the like button or dropping a comment below, really helps more than you think. I'd truly like to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. And as always, have a good one.